Do you want to be ahead of the game for the latest in arts, music, cuisine, and entertainment across the Middle East's most dynamic capital cities? Al Monitor is proud to launch our City Pulse newsletters, focused exclusively on local news, starting in Riyadh, Dubai, Istanbul, and Doha. Each week, our on-the-ground writers in these cities cover the latest cultural happenings and trends, so you have everything you need to know for the best local experiences. To subscribe for free, go to almonitor.com, that's al-monitor.com, and sign up on our newsletter page.
Welcome to On the Middle East, Al Monitor's podcast on the big and interesting developments in the region. My name is Ambryn Zaman, and today I'll be revisiting Syria. It's been 3 months since Syria's longtime dictator Bashar al-Assad was overthrown by an alliance of Islamist factions led by an Islamist radical called Ahmed al-Shara. Shara has since declared himself interim president and says he will form a new and inclusive government. But he has yet to match his words with deeds, and challenges abound. With me here to assess how things look under al-Shara and what lies ahead is Professor Joshua Landis, a leading expert on Syria who runs the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Welcome to our program, Joshua. It's great to have you with us here today. So it's been 3 months since Shara came to power. What's your assessment? I mean, if you were grading him, what kind of marks would you give him?
Well, he's under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. And, I would give him an A for his outreach. I'd give him a C or maybe even a D for tearing apart the state institutions. I understand why he's doing it. They were crammed with Alawites and regime loyalists. And the Assad regime was all about loyalty. And he feels that he needs to completely take it apart. The trouble is that this has frozen the Syrian economy. People have not been paid. There are over 2 million Syrian government employees who aren't getting their salaries. Maybe a few of them are, but it seems to be very irregular. I've been asking friends and others, and many have just not been able to get their pensions or their salaries or so forth. They don't know whether they're going to be fired or not. So tearing down the institutions so precipitously, without any mechanism for getting money back into the economy, for protecting people's lives, has pushed many into desperate poverty and has really caused the economy, which was already at a frozen state, to really lurch, to really freeze up. And that I think has been, is going to come back to bite him, because more and more people are beginning to become dissatisfied. Now, it should be said that he has a tremendous amount of what's being called revolutionary legitimacy, or a big honeymoon period, because he did dislodge the Assad regime, which almost every Syrian saw as being terribly oppressive and having led Syria to a dead end. Not to mention all of the terrible stories we're reading about the torture in the prisons and so forth. But at the same time, we're seeing many of the same problems that Assad faced. In other words, Israel, centrifugal forces, Kurds wanting some sort of autonomy, the Druze wanting autonomy, and the many different elements of Syria pulling apart. And Shara doesn't really have an answer for this today. And that's going to haunt him as well, and America's relations. These are all things that plagued Assad, and they're going to plague him as well. And it's going to force him, I believe, to return to many of the policies that Assad pursued previously, particularly in foreign policy.
But it is also true that Syria is still under heavy sanctions, that there's a huge cash flow problem, and that because of these sanctions, governments that would normally want to help him out, like the Saudis, the Turks, the UAE, for all the carve-outs that have been made, are still facing huge problems trying to help this government. And so is he really to blame for the fact that people aren't getting paid? We hear that there's a actual physical money problem and that people are now being limited in terms of the amount of cash they can withdraw from banks. I mean, it seems to me it goes beyond people being laid off. I mean, if they hadn't been laid off, it seems to me he would still probably have trouble paying them, right?
Well, this very well may be true. He's got a currency problem on his hands, and he just did a deal with Russia, which has traditionally printed, at least during the Civil War, printed the Syrian currency. And Russia has sent them a big load of actual, Syrian bills, which he needs. But that is part of the problem. The thing is, Qatar promised him almost $1 billion in order to quadruple wages, government wages, which had, because of inflation, had sunk to about $30 a month for mid-range people and much less for others. And so Syrians needed that jolt, but it is partly due to the problems of a transitional government, but he hasn't concentrated on trying to get money into the hands of people. And we saw this, for example, in the debates at the national dialogue conference that took place a week ago in the economic division. There was serious disagreement over what role the state should play. And traditionally, the Syrian state has been a real socialist state in the sense that it has guaranteed many people sort of basic services, free education, free healthcare. Now, those have been terrible. I mean, the level of education, the level of healthcare, we can all criticize them. But there was an effort to subsidize foods, basic foods like bread, oil, corn oil, and so forth, mazout, the basic energy, electricity and gas. This has bankrupted the Assad state and is part of the reason for its massive failure. But at the same time, we're going the opposite direction quite rapidly. And this is leaving tons of people without any security before there are jobs to replace them or before there's an economy which can pick up the slack. So people are quite desperate. And I think, and that's leading to these centrifugal forces that we're hearing more and more about. And it's allowing Israel to fish in these troubled waters. And it's not clear what role the United States will play and whether it will join Israel in promoting or advancing a more federal style government in Syria.
You mentioned Israel. Israel has used the Druze issue to justify its expanding footprint in the Golan Heights, moving troops into the buffer zone and saying they'll stay put. Some Druze are welcoming Israeli intervention, but not all. So what is Israel's game plan?
The vast majority of Druze leaders went to the national dialogue, have objected to Israel's efforts and claims to want to protect the Druze, said that they are loyal Syrians. But at the same time, this provides the Druze with greater leverage against Damascus in this demand for local autonomy, for self-government, greater self-government. And so there is an ambiguous relationship to this. I think the vast majority of Druze understand that their future is with Damascus. Their future is with Syria. They need services from Damascus, electricity, water, all kinds of services, education. The Jebel Druze is not a wealthy place and it doesn't have enough water. So it needs the state. It just wants the state on its terms. And Israel it can help with that in a sense by having that fear, Damascus's inability to move troops to the Jebel Druze. So in that sense, the Druze leaders are getting it both ways. I think they want to keep Israel at arm's length and show that they're loyal Syrians, but at the same time, they're using the added leverage that they have from Israel.
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al-Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al-Monitor to follow what leaders and decision makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com, that's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25 for a discount.
Israel is also courting Syria's Kurds. The foreign minister, Gideon Saar, says they should be granted federal status. Is there not a risk that Israeli support for minorities will turn the Sunni Arab majority against them? Should Shara not be doing more to accommodate minorities?
Of course, it does polarize the country. Increasingly, you're hearing Arab Syrians accusing the Kurds and the Druze of being disloyal and being traitors. And the rhetoric is growing on both sides, and accusations are growing as people dig in their heels. So, much of this is really going to depend on the United States, because the United States is the power in northeast Syria. It has 2,000 troops, and it has a no-fly zone. Turkey is not willing to really combat the United States on that level, although it keeps on sending drones and assassinating Kurdish leaders. But much will depend on whether the United States decides to withdraw. And President Trump has been really very close-lipped about Syria, and he hasn't appointed a special envoy, and he hasn't made any indication on how he's going to move in Syria. Previous to coming to power, of course, he said he wanted to get out of Syria. But many of his closest national security advisors want to stay in Syria and are reluctant to withdraw power. We saw the Secretary of State during his visit to Israel just recently called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the new government in Damascus a dangerous government. And that the fall of Assad was good, but it had been replaced with another dangerous government. And he was taking his cues from Prime Minister Netanyahu. And it may be that the United States will take its cues from Netanyahu, who wants America to remain in Syria and wants sanctions to remain on Damascus, and really has been quite open about wanting to keep Syria weak and divided. And that
he wants to keep the Russians there too in order to counter Turkish influence. That's what we're hearing.
Yes, we have heard that, the bases, and that may be something that Ahmed Shara, the new president, will entertain, because he needs to build up his military, and he doesn't want to be completely dependent on Turkey. And we saw a little bit of discontent from Erdogan in the visit in which Ahmed Shara went to visit him in Ankara, and it was quite clear that Erdogan was unhappy because he wants a military agreement with Syria, and Shara had resisted this. So if he wants to keep from being completely dependent on Turkey, he's going to have to go to Russia, particularly if Israel continues to attack his military and push Syrians out of their land in southern Syria.
But I mean, isn't that a bit of a contradiction? Because if it's the Israelis who are lobbying for the Russians to stay because they want to counter Turkish influence, are you saying that this puts Shara and Israel on the same page? To me, it almost seems like, if anything, Shara will be forced to turn to Turkey under these circumstances, especially if Israel keeps up its current aggressive stance. I mean, what can, in fact, Russian forces do for him? They're just there to use the port, but not necessarily to do much else, are they?
Well, they would provide weaponry to, I mean, they could provide anti-aircraft missiles and so forth and negotiate with Israel. Russia and Israel have fairly good relations on a number of levels. They're in communications over Ukraine, over Georgia, over many other places where Israel has sold weapons and provided weapons, and Russia doesn't like it. And Russia has often in the past used Syria really as a leverage against Israel in order to make sure that Israel doesn't give advanced weapons to places like Georgia or Ukraine by threatening to give advanced weapons to Syria. And so that dynamic has helped protect Syria in the past. Not very well, but it has. And so it may be the best that he can do. He will have to turn your other part of your question, which is, will this force him into the arms of Turkey? Yes, it's going to do that. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's not one, I think, that Netanyahu is frightened of. He, in a sense, by turning Syria into an enemy and increasingly turning Turkey into an enemy of the United States as well as Israel, it provides him with a reason to stay in Lebanon, stay in Syria, and to acquire more land. So in that sense, it forces the United States to choose who it's going to side with. Is it
Oh
going to
my
side with
God.
Syria, or
This
is it going
sounds
to
so
side with?
Machiavellian. I mean, and would this extend to the Kurds as well? Because you also see these crazy maps now of a corridor linking the Druze to the Kurds and Israel sort of being their patron. I mean, is that realistic? I mean, can we actually see um, Israel mentoring that kind of a connection between the Druze and the Kurds and somehow becoming their guarantors?
You know, I wish I knew that map that you're talking about that has been circulating around. It seems fantastical, but I think what it's as an actual map, I think it's silly. But as an idea of a Syria that's divided, it's not silly. It is a danger for Damascus right now that Shara and his military will not be able to regain control over the peripheries of Syria, particularly the Kurdish region and the Druze region, if Israel is going to provide protection and the United States provide them protection in the north. Now, of course, this will suck America into a struggle it really doesn't belong in and can't sort out. But um, but it could happen, and it has given a fillip to many Syrians who are fearful of Shara's rule, and they are clinging. We see desperate cries from all sorts of Syrians who don't like this government, and in that sense, it gives them a shot in the arm to think or dream about a federal system, about some alternative system for Syria than the one that's being cooked up in Damascus right now.
Yeah, the one that's been cooked up, sorry, with very little inclusion of other groups, which is one of the biggest critiques of Shara. And so let's turn to the Alawites who almost nobody's talking about yet are the ones who I think are really bearing the brunt of the abuse, correct? I mean, we talk about the Druze a lot, about the Kurds a lot, but I mean, bad things are actually happening to the Alawites. What do we know about that situation?
Well, almost every day there is some attack on an Alawite village. Now, often these are by people that we don't know whose origin is a little bit vague. Are they Hayat Tahrir al-Sham? Are they officials of the state, or are they other militias? It's not always clear, but we see videos of people burning fields in Alawite towns. There recently was an attack in Qardaha where rockets were fired and so forth. Both sides were accusing the other side of starting it and aggression. But there's a lot of disorder. And there are people who've disappeared. There's attacks on houses. There's a lot of criminality that just seems to be spreading because people can get away with it. And so government control hasn't been asserted very well. But then there's the overall anxiety amongst the Alawites that they're being purged from government institutions, not only from the military and the police, which is quite natural, but also from education, from the Port Authority in Latakia. It was reported just recently that about 12,000 jobs have been eliminated. Now, the government says that most of those are ghost workers who didn't show up, but there are people who are saying, no, I was showing up and my job has been eliminated. And it's unclear whether the natural desire of the central government to get rid of the corruption within the state institutions and to limit the amount of jobs that the state has to pay for is also giving cover to state officials to purge Alawites from the ranks of these institutions. And the Alawites are quite convinced that they are going to be purged and that they are being purged. And, I talked to a friend whose sister in Latakia is the head of a division in the hospital, local hospital. And his sisters spoke about how the Alawites are being replaced in the chain of command, and that people with very little qualifications but attachments to the new government are being put in charge of very sensitive jobs, and that is causing chaos. But it also is just sending a message that that the government has changed. Alawites are no longer have no protection. And that they're going to be pushed out of their positions of authority. And that process is just gathering speed as we speak.
And nobody's speaking up for them. Who has the back of the Alawites?
Well, that's their big problem. And I hear from Alawites who are constantly saying, we need foreign protection. There is an element of Alawites. Now, this is not the majority, but there is a growing call amongst Alawites who are quite frantic and saying, we need foreign protection. And of course, they're not going to get it. I mean, this is the same thing that I heard living in Lebanon in the middle of the civil war. You constantly heard various communities asking for American or even Israeli and other help. It was not going to come. But it's an indication of the anxiety amongst the Alawites that this call for some kind of a foreign protector is growing. And it's growing in other parts of Syria too, because people don't know what their future is.
Well, it's pretty depressing, isn't it, Joshua? Everything we just talked about. Where's the hope?
Well, the hope is that the United States would decide that this government is the best option for stability in the region, and that it would lift sanctions and begin to help shut up, develop proper institutions. That would be, and that the World Bank, IMF, and other institutions the UN would get involved again in Syria and help with development. And this would provide jobs and would allay the great anxieties which are fueling much of this discontent and the centrifugal forces that have always been there in Syria, but are gathering speed because of the deep anxiety about where money is going to come from and whether the central state is being fair to them.
Yeah, but at what price? I mean, as you say, Netanyahu has tremendous sway with Trump, and if Trump
Yes, Trump's hands are full.
agrees with his vision for Syria, doesn't sound good for Sharon at all, doesn't sound good for Syria, because I don't see how this federal model would be sustainable given the fierce opposition that's obviously going to come from Turkey, for example. And I don't see any of the Arab countries particularly encouraging this either. So, and then you've got the Islamic State lurking in the background. It just doesn't sound too good. But let's
No, it doesn't sound good. And we're looking at what's happening in Gaza at the same time as we're looking at what's happening in Syria. And we're looking for some kind of American leadership on these issues. And we just heard in Gaza, as the question of is there going to be a phase 2 comes up, and Prime Minister Netanyahu has sort of indicated there's not going to be a phase 2, and has made increasing demands of Gaza. And President Trump has sort of said that he's going to side with Netanyahu on these debates, just quite simply, and that he's not going to stand behind the Palestinians. And so one assumes to a certain degree that he will take a similar stand on Syria, which would be bad news for Damascus and the attempt to develop a central state that is stable and that will include elements of Syria, all elements of Syria.
Well, on that note, Joshua, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to having you here again, and hopefully to describe something brighter.
Always a pleasure, Amber.
Thank you. Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much for tuning in, and do go to www.al-monitor.com for in-depth analysis from our expert team and the latest news from the Middle East.